The sinister. Sigmund Freud. The sinister. The psychoanalyst only rarely feels the incentive to undertake aesthetic investigations, although it is not intended to confine aesthetics to the doctrine of the beautiful, but rather considers it as a science of the qualities of our sensibility. Psychoanalytic activity is oriented towards other layers of our psychic life and has little contact with the emotional impulses, ultimately inhibited, muffled, dependent on so many simultaneous constellations, that usually form the material of aesthetics. However, the occasion may arise that he is impelled to lend his interest to a certain sector of aesthetics, generally dealing with one that is sort of out of the way, that is neglected by aesthetic literature itself. The unheimlich, the sinister, forms one of these domains. There is no doubt that this concept is close to that of the terrifying, anguishing, terrifying, but it is no less certain that the term is often applied in a somewhat indeterminate meaning, so that it almost always coincides with the anguishing in general. However, we can entertain the hope that the use of a special term unheimlich to denote a certain concept will be justified by the finding in it of a particular nucleus. In short, we would like to know what that core is, that essential and proper sense that allows us to discern, in what is distressing, something that is also sinister. The detailed aesthetic expositions tell us little about this, which moreover prefer to deal with what is beautiful, grandiose, and attractive, that is, with feelings of a positive tone, their conditions of appearance and the objects that arouse them, disdaining instead the reference to contrary, repulsive, and unpleasant feelings. As for the medical psychological literature, I only know the dissertation by E. Jentsch, which, although full of interest, does not exhaust the subject. I must confess, in any case, that for reasons that are easy to guess, depending on current circumstances, I was unable to consult the respective literature in depth, particularly foreign literature, so I place this work in the hands of the reader without supporting any claim of priority. Jentsch rightly points out that a difficulty in the study of the uncanny is due to the fact that the ability to experience this sensitive quality occurs to an extremely uneven degree in different individuals. Even I myself must blame myself for a particular disparate stupidity in this regard, when a subtle sensitivity would be much more convenient, for a long time I have not experienced or known anything that would give me the impression of the sinister, so I must deliberately evoke this sensation, arouse in myself a state of mind conducive to it. However, difficulties of this kind are also typical of many other domains of aesthetics, and because of them we will certainly not abandon the hope of finding cases that lend themselves to admitting in them, without a doubt and solely, the phenomenon in question. We can now choose between two paths: either find out the meaning that the evolution of language has deposited in the term unheimlich, or gather everything that in people and things, in sensory impressions, experiences, and situations, we produce the feeling of sinister, thus deducing the hidden character of it through what all these cases have in common. We confess without delay that either of the two paths will lead us to the same result. The sinister would be that kind of frightful that affects things known and familiar for a long time. In what follows it will be seen how this is possible and under what conditions familiar things can turn sinister, frightening. I also want to note that in this investigation I began by collecting a series of particular cases, finding confirmation only later in the turns of language. When exposing the subject, instead, I will follow the reverse path. The German word unheimlich is undoubtedly the antonym of heimlich and heimisch, intimate, secret, and familiar, homely, domestic, thus imposing the deduction that the sinister causes fright precisely because it is not familiar, but, of course, not everything that is new and unusual is therefore frightening, so that relationship is not reversible. All that can be said is that the novelty easily becomes frightening and sinister, but only some new things are frightful, they are by no means all. Something must be added to the new and unusual to make it sinister. Jentsch has not gone beyond, in general terms, this relationship between the uncanny and the novel, unfamiliar. Locates in intellectual uncertainty the basic condition for the feeling of the sinister to occur. According to him, the sinister would always be something in which one finds oneself, as it were, bewildered, lost. The more oriented a man is in the world, the less easily the things and events of it will give him the impression of the sinister. But we will easily verify that this characterization of the sinister does not exhaust its meanings, so we will try to overcome the sinister equals unusual equation. Let us turn first of all to other languages, but behold, dictionaries do not tell us anything new, perhaps simply because those languages are not ours. Indeed, we even get the impression that many languages lack a term that expresses this particular shade of the frightening. Latin, according to K. George's Little German Latin Dictionary, 1898, a sinister place, locus suspectus, at a sinister hour of the night, stormy night. Greek, Rost and Skinkel dictionaries xenos, that is, foreigner, stranger, unknown. English, according to Lucas, Bellow, Flugel, Muret Sanders dictionaries uncomfortable, uneasy. Gloomy, dismal, uncanny, ghastly, referring to a house, haunted, of a man, a repulsive fellow. French, Saxvillate inquietant, sinister, gloomy, mal à son eyes. Spanish, Tollhausen, 1889, suspicious of bad omen, gloomy, sinister. Asterisk. The Italian and Portuguese languages seem to make do with words that we would designate as circumlocutions. In Arabic and Hebrew, unheimlich coincides with demonic, creepy. Let us return, therefore, to the German language. In the Wörterbuch Deutschen Sprache, by Daniel Sanders, 1860, the article heimlich contains the following indications, which I will reproduce in full, highlighting some passages, volume I, page 729, asterisk. Heimlich, a. Kate, FN1, also heimelig, heimelig, typical of the house, not strange, familiar, docile, intimate, confidential, what reminds of home, etc. A. Archaism, belonging to the house, to the family, or, considered as proper to such, cif. The T. familiaris, customary, die Heimlichen, the intimate, die Hausgenossen, the co-inhabitants of the house, der Heimlichrat, the intimate council, general, 41, 45, 2. Samuel, 23, 23, 1. Chronicles 12, 25, Prov 8, 4, term now replaced by Geheimer, c. D1, rat, c. Heimlicher. B. It is said of tame, domesticated animals. Opposite of wild, for example, animals that are neither wild nor heimlich, etc. Eppendorf, 88. Wild animals, that are tamed to make them heimlich and accustomed to people, 92. When these little beasts are raised from a very young age next to man, they take very heimlich that they eat from my hand, holding. The stork will always be a beautiful and heimlich bird, Link. School, 146. C. Hauslich, 1, etc. C. Intimate, familiar, that evokes well-being, etc., comfortable, calm and safe protection, like the comfortable and warm house. C. Geheuer. Can you still feel heimlich in your country, when foreigners cut down your forests? Alexis H. I. 1, 289. She didn't feel very heimlich, by the murmuring stream, etc. Foster, Volume I, 417. Destroy the Heimlichkeit of the Fatherland, Gervinus, Lit 5, 375. I would not easily find such a heimlich corner, G. 14, 14. We felt so comfortable, so calm and comfortable, so heimlich, 15, 9. In quiet Heimlichkeit, in the narrow confines of home, Haller. A diligent housewife, who knows how to make a delicious Heimlichkeit with little, Hartmann UNST, 1, 188. The more heimlich man now seemed to him, until recently strange, Kerner, 540. The Protestant owners did not feel Heimlich and silent, and friendly and Heimlich, as if one would long for a place to rest, W11, 144. There was nothing Heimlich in that trance, 27, 170, etc. Further, the place was so calm, so lonely, so Heimlich and shady, share. Pilg. 170. The waves advanced and receded, dreamy and Heimlich, rocking chairs, corner, SCH3, 320, etc. C. Unheimlich. Particularly among Swabian and Swiss authors, it frequently adopts three syllables, how heimlich Ivo felt at night, when he was lying in his house, Auerbach, D1, 249. In that house I felt so heimelig, 4, 307. The warm room, the heimelig evening, Gothelf, SCH 127, 148. Here is something that is very heimelig, when man feels in the bottom of his heart how little he is, how great is the Lord, 147. Little by little one found himself more comfortable and heimelig, U1, 297. The sweet heimelig that here, 327, Pestalozzi, 4, 240. Whoever comes from afar, will not be able to live very heimelig, friendly, as a neighbor, with the people, 325. The cabin where he once sat, so heimelig, so happy, among his own, Reithard, 20. The watchman's horn sounds so heimelig from the tower, her voice, so hospitable, invites us, 49. One sleeps here so warmly, so wonderfully heimelig, 23, etc. This meaning would have deserved to be generalized, to prevent such an appropriate word from falling into disuse, due to its easy confusion with, to. For example, the Zeks are also heimlich, to, heimlich. What do you mean by heimlich? Well then, that I sit with them as before a refilled well or a dry pond. One cannot pass by these without having the impression that the water will spring up again, some day. We, here, call him unheimlich, you call him heimlich. In what do you find that this family has something secret and uncertain, etc. Gutskow, R. 2, 61. D. C. C. Especially in Silesia, cheerful, humorous, it is also said of time, c. Adelung und Weinhold. Too secret, hidden, so that others cannot notice it, wanting to hide something, c. Geheim, secret, 2. A voice from which it is not always accurately distinguished, especially in New High German and in the older language, as, for example, in the Bible, Job, 11, 6, 15, 8, Prov 2, 22, I Corinth 2, 7, etc. Also, Heimlichkeit, instead of Geheimnis, secret, Matt 13, 35, etc. Voices that are not always distinguished with precision, for example, do something heimlich, behind someone else's back, get away heimlich, sneaking away, heimlich, clandestine, meetings, to contemplate the misfortune of others with heimlich joy, sigh, cry heimlich, in secret, behave heimlich, mysteriously, as if one had something to hide, love, heimlich, secret, sin, heimlich places, which modesty forces to hide, love, heimlich sin, mysteriously, as if one had something to hide, love, heimlich, secret, sin, heimlich places, which modesty forces to hide, 1, Sam 5, 6, the heimlich place, referring to the toilet, 2. Kings, 10, 27, Prov 5, 256, etc., also in, Der Heimlichstuhl, the secret seat, Zinkgraf 1, 249, throwing someone into the well, at Heimlichkeiten, 3, 75, Rollenhagen 83 francs, etc. He presented him as heimlich, perfidious and devious against cruel lords, as frank, open, sympathetic, and helpful towards his friend who suffers. Burmeister GB 2, 157, you must also know what is most Heimlich and sacred to me. Chamisso 4, 56, the Heimlich, occult, art of magic. 3, 224. Where public discussion ceases, at the command of the Heimlich conspirators, the battle cry of the declared revolutionaries, G4, 222. A holy, Heimlich influence. 15. I have roots that are very Heimlich, hidden, in the deepest earth I am rooted. 2, 109. My Heimlich malice, c. Heimtuck, 30, 344. If he does not accept it openly and consciously, he could take it Heimlich and secretly achromatic glasses. 375. Henceforth, I would like nothing Heimlich, secret, to be between us. SCH 369b. Discover, publish, betray someone's Heimlichkeiten, secrets, plot behind my back the Heimlichkeiten, Alavis. H2, 3, 168. In my time, Heimlichkeit, discretion, used to be practiced. Hagedorn, 3, 92. The Heimlichkeit, intrigue, and gossip that are committed in secret. Immermann, M3, 289. Only the action of knowledge can break the action of the Heimlichkeit of hidden gold. Novalis, 1, 69. Tell me where you keep it, in what place of silent Heimlichkeit. SCHR 495, b. Bees that form the key of the Heimlichkeiten, wax for sealing secret letters. Teich, CYMB 3, 2. To be skilled in rare Heimlichkeiten, magical arts. Schlegel, SH, 6, 102, etc. See, Geheimnis L10, page 291 et sec. In this regard, C1c, as well as, in particular, the antonym unheimlich, disturbing, which provokes atrocious terror, that almost seemed to him unheimlich, sinister, spectral. Chamisso, 3, 238. The unheimlich, sinister and gloomy hours of the night. 4, 148. For a long time I felt unheimlich, horrified. 242. I begin to feel unheimlich. Verm 1, 51. Unheimlich and motionless, like a stone statue. Rees, 1, 10. The unheimlich fog, called Harrock, Immermann, M. 3, 299. These pale young men are unheimlich and meditate on God knows what evil. Lob, Volume 1, 119. Anything is called unheimlich that, having to remain secret, hidden, nevertheless, has been manifested. Schelling, 2, 649. Veiling the divine, surrounding it with a certain unheimlichkeit, mystery. 658, etc. It is not used as an antonym of, to, as Camp presents it, without any foundation. From this long quote the interesting fact emerges for us that the word Heimlich has, among the numerous nuances of its meaning, one in which it coincides with its antonym, unheimlich. Remember the example of Gutskow. We, here, call it unheimlich, you call it Heimlich. In the rest, he warns us that this word, Heimlich, does not have a single meaning, but belongs to two groups of representations that, without being exactly antagonistic, are nevertheless quite far apart. It is about what is familiar, comfortable, on the one hand, and of the hidden, concealed, on the other. Unheimlich would only be used as an antonym of the first of these senses, and not as the opposite of the second. Sanders' dictionary tells us nothing about a possible genetic relationship between the two meanings. On the other hand, a note by Schelling calls our attention, which states something completely new and unexpected about the content of the concept unheimlich. Unheimlich would be everything that should have remained hidden, secret, but has manifested itself. Part of our doubts, thus awakened, are resolved by the data offered by the Deutsches Wörterbuch, by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, Leipzig, 1877, 4/2, page 874 and following. Heimlich, adjective and adverb vernaculus, occultus, Middle High German, heimlich, heimlich. Page 874, in a somewhat different sense, I feel heimlich, good, comfortable, without fear. B. Heimlich also designates a place free of ghosts. Page 875, SS, familiar, friendly, intimate. 4. From heimatlich, from the native region, häuslich, home, emanates the notion of what is hidden from strange eyes, hidden, secret, using these terms in various relationships. Page 876, on the left, by the lake, there is a heimlich, hidden, meadow in the woods, Schiller, Tell I, 4. In a somewhat free and rare use in modern language, heimlich is added to a verb that expresses concealment. He will hide heimlich for me in his tent, PS 27, 5. Heimlich, secret, parts of the human body, pudenda. The people who did not die, were damaged in their heimlich parts, secret, genital organs, I Samuel, 5, 12. C. Officials who must provide important and geheim, secret, advice in government affairs are called Heimlichrat, secret advisors, this adjective having been replaced by the more common one, geheim, see this one, the Pharaoh appointed, Joseph, Heimlicher Rath, secret advisor, General 41, 45. Page 878, 6. Heimlich, in relation to knowledge, means mystical or allegorical, heimlich, occult, meaning, mysticus, divinus, occultus, figuratus. Page 878, in the following example, the meaning of heimlich is different, subtracted from knowledge, unconscious. But heimlich also means impenetrable, closed to investigation, don't you see? They don't trust me, they fear the heimlich, impenetrable, face of the Duke of Friedland. Wallenstein's Camp, Act 2. 9. The meaning of hidden, dangerous, hidden, which is expressed in the preceding reference, stands out even more, in such a way that unheimlich ends up accepting the meaning that unheimlich usually has, derived from heimlich, 3b, sp 874. Sometimes I feel like a man who walks at night and believes in ghosts, every corner seems to him heimlich, sinister, and gloomy. Klinger, Theater, 3, 298. Thus, heimlich is a voice whose meaning evolves towards ambivalence, until it ends up coinciding with that of its antithesis, unheimlich. Unheimlich is, in any way, a kind of heimlich. Let us add this result, still insufficiently clarified, to the definition that Schelling gave of the unheimlich, and let us see how the successive examination of different cases of the uncanny will allow us to understand the indications noted. If we now review the people and things, the impressions, events, and situations capable of awakening in us the feeling of the sinister with singular intensity and clarity, it will be necessary for us to choose the first of the examples correctly. Jensch highlighted, as the sinister case par excellence, the doubt that an apparently animated being is actually living, and conversely, that a lifeless object is animated in some way, adducing to this end the impression aroused by wax figures, wise dolls and automata. Compare this impression with that produced by epileptic seizures and manifestations of dementia, since such phenomena would evoke in us vague notions of automatic, mechanical processes that could be hidden under the usual picture of our lives. Without being fully convinced that this opinion of Jensch is correct, we will start our investigation from the following observations of this author, in which he reminds us of a poet who has managed to provoke, like no other, sinister effects. One of the surest ways to easily evoke the uncanny through narratives, writes Jensch, is to let the reader doubt whether a certain figure presented to him is a person or an automaton. This must be done in such a way that uncertainty does not become the focus of attention, because the reader must not come to immediately examine and verify the matter, which, as we said, would easily dissipate his special emotional state. Eda Hoffmann successfully used this psychological maneuver in several of her fantastic tales. This certainly correct observation refers above all to the story Der Sandman, the Sandbox, which is part of the Nachtstück, Night Tales, and from which comes the figure of the Olympia doll that Offenbach made appear in the first act of his opera Hoffmann's Tales. I must say, however, and I hope to have the agreement of almost everyone who has read this story, that the theme of the Olympia doll, apparently animated, can in no way be considered solely responsible for the singularly sinister effect that the story produces. Even more, that it is not even the element to which this effect could be attributed in the first place. The slight satirical overtone that the poet gives to the Olympia episode, using it to ridicule the presumption of his young lover, does not ease that impression either. The center of the story is rather occupied by another theme, precisely the one that gave it its title and that always comes to the fore again at the climax. It is the theme of the sandbox, the Sandman who gouges out the eyes of the creatures. The student Nathaniel, with whose childhood memories the fantastic tale begins, despite his current happiness, cannot get rid of the reminiscences linked to the horrible and mysterious death of his beloved father. On certain nights their mother used to put the children to bed early, threatening them that she would. The man from the sand would come, and sure enough, each time the boy heard the heavy footsteps of a visitor who detained his father for the whole night. When the mother was questioned as to who the sandbox was, she denied that it was more than a way of saying, but a nanny was able to give her more specific information. He is a bad man who comes to see the children when they do not want to sleep. He tells them he throws handfuls of sand into the eyes, making them bleed out of their sockets. Then she puts them in a bag and takes them to the crescent as food for her little children, who sit in a nest and have curved beaks, like owls, with which they peck out the eyes of children who do not look. They have behaved well. Although little Nathaniel was old and intelligent enough not to believe such horrifying things about the sandbox, the terror that it inspired in him remained, nevertheless, fixed on him. He decided to find out what the sandbox looked like, and one night when he was expecting it again, he hid in his wife's workroom. "Father!" He then recognizes in the visitor the lawyer Coppelius, a repulsive character who used to cause fear in children when, on occasions, he was invited for lunch. Thus the hideous sandbox became identified for him with Coppelius. In the rest of the scene, the poet leaves us in suspense as to whether we are dealing with the first delirium of a child possessed by anguish or with a narration of events that, in the fictional world of the story, would have to be considered as real. The father and his guest are by the hearth, busy with some flaming coals. The little spy hears Coppelius exclaim, "Come on, come on, come on." Calls. The father begs for his son's eyes and the event ends with a faint followed by a long illness. Whoever decides to adopt the rationalist interpretation of the sandbox will not fail to recognize in this childhood fantasy the persistent influence of that nanny's narrative. Instead of grains of sand, it is now burning embers that he wants to throw into his eyes, in both cases to make them jump out of their sockets. A year later, on the occasion of a new visit by the sandbox, the father dies in his workroom as a result of an explosion and the lawyer Coppelius disappears from the region without trace. The student Nathaniel believes he recognizes this terrifying apparition of his childhood years in Giuseppe Coppola, an Italian itinerant optician who comes to the university town where he is found to offer him some barometers, and who, when he refuses, exclaims in his jargon, "Hey! Niente barometri, niente barometri. I also have a beautiful Oco, a beautiful Oco." The student's horror fades when he realizes that the offered eyes are nothing but harmless glasses. He buys a pocket telescope from Coppola and with its help he scrutinizes the neighboring house of Professor Spallanzani, managing to see his daughter, the beautiful but mysteriously silent and immobile Olympia. He immediately falls in love with her, so madly that he forgets his shrewd and sensible girlfriend. But Olympia is nothing more than an automatic doll whose mechanism is the work of Spallanzani and to which Coppola the sandbox has provided eyes. The student comes at the moment when both creators are disputing their work. The optician takes the wooden doll, deprived of eyes, and the mechanic, Spallanzani, picks up Olympia's bloody eyes from the floor, throwing them at Nathaniel and exclaiming that it is him Coppola has stolen them from. Nathaniel falls into a new crisis of madness and, in his delirium, the memory of his father's death is combined with this new impression, will of fire, will of fire. Spin, will of fire. Cute. Little wooden doll, beautiful little wooden doll, dance. With these exclamations he rushes over to Olympia's supposed father and tries to strangle him. Restored from his long and serious illness, Nathaniel seems to be finally cured. He longs to marry his girlfriend, whom he has found again. One day they tour the city together, in whose main square the tall tower of the town hall casts its gigantic shadow. The young woman proposes to her boyfriend to go up the tower, while her brother, who accompanies them, will wait for them in the square. From the height, Clara's attention is attracted by a singular character that she finds in her pocket, and immediately she is possessed again by dementia, trying to plunge the young woman into the abyss and shouting, "Dance, little doll of wood." The brother, attracted by the screams of the young woman, saves her and makes her descend in a hurry. Upstairs, the possessed person runs from one side to the other, exclaiming, "Turn, will of fire, turn," words whose origin we know perfectly well. Among the crowded people in the square stands out the lawyer Coppelius, who has just appeared again. We must assume that his vision is what has triggered the madness in Nathaniel. They want to go up to subdue the madman, but Coppelius says, laughing, "Wait, he'll come down on his own." Nathaniel stops suddenly, warns Coppelius, and rushes over the balustrade with a shrill cry, "Yes! Beautiful Oko, beautiful Oko!" There he is, stretched out on the pavement, his head smashed, but the man in the sand has disappeared into the crowd. This brief review leaves no room for any doubt. The feeling of the sinister is inherent in the figure of the sandbox, that is, in the idea of being deprived of one's eyes, and there is nothing to do here with intellectual uncertainty in the sense that Jensch conceives it. The question as to the animate or inanimate character, acceptable as far as the Olympia doll is concerned, cannot even be considered in the face of this much more significant example of the sinister. It is true that the poet provokes in us at first a kind of uncertainty, by not letting us guess, probably intentionally, if he intends to lead us to the real world or to a fantastic world, the product of his will. Of course, he has the right to do one thing or the other, and if he will choose for the setting of his narration, let's say, a world in which specters, demons, and ghosts move, as Shakespeare does in Hamlet, in Macbeth and, in another sense, in The Tempest and A Midsummer Night's Dream, then we will have to submit to the poet, accepting that reality as reality. World of his imagination, as long as we abandon ourselves to his story. But in the course of Hoffmann's story that doubt is dispelled and we realize that the poet wants us to look at ourselves through the devilish optician's glass, or that perhaps he himself has also looked through one of those instruments. The end of the story clearly shows us that the optician Coppola is, in effect, the lawyer Coppelius, and therefore also the man in the sand. It is no longer a question here of intellectual uncertainty. We now know that it was not intended to present us with the delusions of a madman, after which we, with our rational superiority, would have to recognize the true state of affairs, but this revelation does not in the least reduce the sinister impression. So that intellectual uncertainty does not make it easy for us to understand such a sinister effect. Instead, the psychoanalytic experience reminds us that hurting the eyes or losing sight is a source of terrible childhood anxiety. This fear persists in many adults, to whom no mutilation frightens as much as that of the eyes. Don't you have the habit of saying that you take care of something like an arm and a leg? The study of dreams, fantasies, and myths also teaches us that the fear of losing one's eyes, the fear of going blind, is a frequent substitute for castration anxiety. Also, the punishment imposed by Oedipus, the mythical criminal, when blinded, is nothing more than an attenuated castration, a penalty that according to the law of retaliation would be the only one appropriate to his crime. Placing oneself in a rationalist point of view, one could try to deny that the fear for the eyes is related to castration anxiety. It would then be found perfectly understandable that an organ as precious as the eye should be protected with a corresponding anxiety. It could even be to affirm that behind the castration anxiety there is no deep secret, no meaning other than the mutilation itself. But this does not take into account the mutual substitution between the eye and the virile member, manifested in dreams, fantasies, and myths, nor will it succeed in undermining the impression that precisely the threat of losing the sexual organ arouses a particularly intense and enigmatic feeling. A feeling that later also affects the representations of the loss of other organs. All our doubts disappear when analyzing neurotics, we learn about the particularities of this castration complex and the immense role it plays in psychic life. Nor would I advise any adversary of psychoanalysis to use Hoffman's tale of the sandbox in order to affirm that the fear of the eyes would be independent of the castration complex. Well, if that were the case, why does the anguish for the eyes closely related to the death of the father appear here? Why does the sandbox return every time as love's killjoy? First, he separates the unfortunate student from his girlfriend and her brother, his best friend. Then he destroys his second love object, the beautiful Olympia doll, finally drives him to commit suicide, just before his happy union with Clara, whom he has just met again. These elements of the story, like many others, seem arbitrary and meaningless if the link between fear of the eyes and castration is rejected, but instead they become full of significance as soon as, instead of the sandbox, the feared father, to whom the purpose of castration is attributed. Thus, we dare to refer the sinister character of the sandbox to the child castration complex. But the mere idea that such a childish factor could have engendered this feeling prompts us to look for a similar derivation that applies to other examples of the sinister. In the sandbox, the theme of the apparently alive doll, which Jensch pointed out, still appears. According to this author, the circumstance that an intellectual uncertainty is awakened regarding the animate or inanimate character of something, or that an object deprived of life adopts an appearance very close to it, are extremely favorable for the production of feelings of the sinister. But with dolls we have come quite close to childhood. We will remember that the child, in his first years of play, does not usually draw a very precise limit between living things and inanimate objects, and that he likes to treat his doll as if it were made of flesh and blood. We even occasionally heard from a patient that even at the age of 8 she was convinced that if she looked at her dolls particularly penetratingly they would come to life. Thus, the infantile factor here too can be easily demonstrated, but strangely enough, in the case of the sandbox it was the resuscitation of an old infantile anxiety, faced with the living doll. On the other hand, we are no longer talking about anguish. The child was not afraid of the idea of seeing his doll alive, and perhaps even wanted it. So that in this case the source of the feeling of the sinister would not be found in a childish anxiety, but in a desire, or perhaps just in a childish belief. Here is something that seems contradictory. But it is possible that it is only a multiplicity of manifestations that can later facilitate our understanding. E.D.A. Hoffmann is the peerless master of the sinister in literature. His novel Los Elixirs del Diablo presents a whole set of themes to which the sinister effect of the narrative could be attributed. The plot of the novel is too rich and intertwined to be able to attempt to refer to it in a review. At the end of the book, when the conventions on which the action was based and which had hitherto been concealed from the reader are finally communicated to him, lo and behold, he is not informed, but rather completely confused. The poet has accumulated too many such effects. The impression produced by the whole does not suffer from it, but our understanding does. It is necessary that we settle for selecting, among these themes that evoke a sinister effect, the most prominent, in order to investigate whether it is also possible to find an origin for them in children's sources. Thus, we find ourselves, First of all, with the theme of the double or the other self, in all its variations and developments, that is to say, with the appearance of people who, because of their equal figure, must be considered identical, with the enhancement of this relationship through the transmission of the mental processes of a person to his double, what we would call telepathy so that one participates in what the other knows, thinks, and experiences, with the identification of one person with another, in such a way that he loses control over his own self and places the self of others in place of his own, that is, splitting of the self, partition of the self, substitution of the self, finally with the constant return of the similar, with the repetition of the same facial features, characters, destinies, criminal acts, even of the same names in several successive generations. The subject of the double has been thoroughly investigated, under this same title, in a work by O'Rank. This author studies the relationships between the double and the image in the mirror, in the shadow, guardian geniuses, animistic doctrines, and the fear of death. But it also sheds a bright light on the surprising evolution of this topic. Indeed, the double was originally a security measure against the destruction of the self, a strong denial of the omnipotence of death, O'Rank, and the immortal soul was probably the first double of our body. The creation of such a doubling, destined to ward off annihilation, has its parallel in an expressive idiom of dream language, consisting of representing castration by duplicating or multiplying the genital symbol. In the culture of the ancient Egyptians, this tendency compels artists to fashion the image of the dead with a lasting substance. But these representations arose in the field of unlimited egophilia, of primitive narcissism that dominates the child's soul as well as that of primitive man, and only when this phase is overcome does the algebraic sign of the double change, of an insurer of survival. He becomes a sinister messenger of death. But the idea of the double does not necessarily disappear with this original proto-narcissism, since it is possible that it acquires new contents in the later phases of the evolution of the ego. In this, a particular instance gradually develops that opposes the rest of the self, which serves self-observation and self-criticism, which fulfills the function of psychic censorship, and which our consciousness knows as conscience. In the pathological case of delusion of reference, this instance is isolated, separated from the self, making it perceptible to the doctor. The existence of such an instance capable of treating the rest of the self as if it were an object, that is, the possibility that man is capable of self-observation, allows the old representation of the double to acquire a new content and to attribute a new meaning to it. Series of elements. First, everything that self-criticism considers to belong to the overcome narcissism of primitive times. But not only this offensive content for ego criticism can be incorporated into the double, but also all the possibilities of our existence that have not found realization and that the imagination does not resign itself to abandoning, all the aspirations of the ego that could not be fulfilled due to adverse circumstances, the illusion of free will. But having exposed in this way the manifest motivation of the double, we are here forced to confess that nothing we have said is enough to explain to us the extraordinary degree of sinister character that is proper to that figure. On the other hand, our knowledge of pathological psychic processes allows us to add that there is nothing in this content that reaches to account for the defensive tendency that projects the double outside the ego, like a strange thing. The sinister character can only be due to the fact that the double is a formation belonging to primitive and superseded psychic epochs, in which no doubt had a less hostile meaning. The double has become a scarecrow, just as the gods become demons once their religions fall. Heine, Die Götter im Exil. The gods in exile. Applying the pattern provided by the double theme, it is easy to appreciate the other disorders of the self that Hoffmann uses in his stories. They consist of a return to certain phases of the evolution of the ego feeling, in a regression to the time in which the ego had not yet been clearly demarcated in front of the outside world and the neighbor. I believe that these themes help to give Hoffmann's stories their sinister character, although it is not easy to determine their part in producing that atmosphere. The factor of the repetition of the similar may not be accepted by all as the source of the feeling in question. According to my observations, under certain conditions and in combination with certain circumstances, it undoubtedly arouses the sensation of the sinister, which on the other hand reminds us of the sensation of intimacy of many dream states. One day, walking on a warm summer afternoon through the deserted and unknown streets of a small Italian town, I came upon a neighborhood whose character cannot be left in doubt for long, since only people peeking out of the windows of the small houses they saw painted women, so I hastened to leave the alley, taking the first shortcut. But after having wandered without a guide for some time, I suddenly found myself in the same street, where I was already beginning to attract attention. My hasty retreat only had the consequence that, after a new detour, I came upon it for the third time. But then a feeling took possession of me that could only be described as sinister, and I was glad when, giving up my explorations, I found again the square from which I had started. Other situations that have in common with the previous one the involuntary return to the same place, although they differ radically in other elements, nevertheless produce the same impression of inertness and sinisterness. For example, when one gets lost, surprised by the fog on a wooded mountain, and despite all his efforts to find a marked or familiar path, he returns several times to the same place characterized by a certain aspect. Or when you wander through an unfamiliar and dark room, looking for the door or the light switch, and instead bump into the same piece of furniture for the 10th time, this situation that Mark Twain, although through a grotesque exaggeration, was able to endow with irresistible comedy. We can also easily find this character in another series of facts. It is only the factor of involuntary repetition that makes what in other circumstances would be innocent seem sinister, thus imposing on us the idea of the nefarious, of the inescapable, where in another case only we would have spoken of chance. Thus, for example, it is surely an indifferent experience if in the cloakroom they give us, when we hand over our hat, a certain number, say, 62, or if we find that our cabin on the ship bears that number. But this impression changes if both facts, indifferent in themselves, come close, to the point that the number 62 is found several times in the same day, or if it still happens that how much a number has, addresses, hotel rooms, cars, railroad, etc. always presents the same figure, at least as a partial element. This is considered sinister, and whoever is not armored against superstition will be tempted to attribute a mysterious meaning to this obstinate return of the same number, seeing in it, for example, an allusion to the age that will not survive. Or if, in another case, just beginning to study the works of the great physiologist H. Herring, letters are received a few days apart and from different countries, from two persons bearing the same name, while until then never he had been in association with so-called individuals. An intelligent investigator recently tried to reduce facts of this class to certain laws, thus inevitably removing all sinister character from them. I would not presume to decide if you have been successful in your undertaking. As for the sinister evoked by the return of the similar and the way in which the state of mind derives from the infantile psychic life, I can only mention it in this connection, referring to the rest to a new exposition of the subject, in other relationships, which I already have prepared. I limit myself, then, to pointing out that unconscious psychic activity is dominated by an automatism or repetition impulse, compulsive repetition, inherent, in all probability, to the very essence of instincts, provided with sufficient power to overcome the pleasure principle. An impulse that gives certain manifestations of psychic life a demonic character, which still manifests itself with great clarity in the tendencies of the small child, and which dominates part of the course followed by the psychoanalysis of the neurotic. All our foregoing considerations dispose us to accept that everything likely to evoke this impulse of internal repetition will be felt as sinister. I believe, however, that the time has come to abandon commenting on these conditions, which are somewhat difficult to appreciate, in order to dedicate ourselves to the search for indubitable cases of the sinister, whose analysis will allow us to definitively decide on the value of our hypothesis. In the Ring of Polycrates, the guest turns away in horror as he realizes that his friend's every wish is instantly fulfilled, his every worry promptly dispelled by fate. His friend has turned sinister on him. The reason he gives himself for this, that whoever is too happy must fear the envy of the gods, seems too obscure to us, since its meaning is mythologically veiled. Let us therefore turn to another example from a much simpler territory. In the clinical history of an obsessive neurosis, I related that this patient had spent some time in a thermal station, to his great benefit, but he had the wisdom not to attribute his improvement not to the curative properties of the waters, but to the location of his room, next to that of a friendly nurse. When he returned to that establishment for the second time, he claimed the same room, but upon hearing that it had already been occupied by an old gentleman, he gave free rein to his displeasure, exclaiming, "Let him die of a potato." 2 weeks later, the gentleman actually suffered a stroke, an event that was sinister for my patient. This impression would have been even stronger if a shorter time had elapsed between his exclamation and the accident, or if several similar episodes had occurred to my patient. In fact, he had no difficulty in providing me with similar confirmations, and not only he, but all the obsessional neurotics that I was able to study told me similar experiences. They were by no means surprised to regularly meet the person of whom, perhaps for the first time in a long time, they had just thought. It regularly happened that they received a letter from a friend in the morning, and the night before they had said, "We haven't heard from so and so for a long time." Above all, accidents or deaths rarely occurred without the idea of that misfortune having crossed his mind shortly before. They communicated this circumstance with the utmost modesty, pretending to have premonitions that almost always came true. One of the most widespread and sinister forms of superstition. One of the most widespread and sinister forms of superstition is the fear of the evil eye, which has been the subject of extensive study by the Hamburg ophthalmologist Sigmund. The source from which this fear emanates never seems to have been mistaken. Whoever possesses something precious, but perishable, fears the envy of others, projecting onto others the same envy that they would have felt in their neighbor's place. Such impulses are usually translated by means of the look, even if one refuses to put them into words, and when someone stands out from the rest by some notable manifestation, especially of an unpleasant character, one is ready to suppose that his envy must have reached a force special and that this force may well lead it to become acts. Therefore, a secret intention to harm is suspected, and based on certain indications it is admitted that this purpose also has sufficient harmful power. These last examples of the sinister are founded on the principle that, according to the suggestion of a patient, I have called omnipotence of thought. At this point in our study we can no longer confuse the terrain on which we find ourselves. The analysis of these various cases of the sinister has led us to an old conception of the world, to animism, characterized by the swarming of human spirits in the world, by the narcissistic overestimation of one's own psychic processes, by the omnipotence of thought and by the technique of magic that is based on it, by the attribution of magical forces, minutely graduated to strange people and objects, mana, and finally by all the creations by means of which the unlimited narcissism of that evolutionary period defended itself against the undeniable force. It seems that in the course of our individual development we have all passed through a phase corresponding to this primitive animism, that in none of us has this phase elapsed without leaving remains and traces capable of manifesting itself at any moment, and by reading the preceding pages, the reader will surely have awakened doubts that will now have the opportunity to condense and express themselves. It may be true that the unheimlich, the sinister, is the Heimlichheimus, the intimate home that has been repressed and has returned from the repression, and that everything that is sinister fulfills this condition. But the enigma of the sinister is not solved with this formula. Obviously, our proposition cannot be inverted. Everything that alludes to repressed desires and superseded forms of thought belonging to individual and collective prehistory is not sinister. Nor do we intend to hide the fact that almost all the examples designed to demonstrate our proposition can be opposed to analogous cases that contradict it. Thus, for example, the severed hand in Hauf's tale, Die Geschichte von der abgehauenen Hand, story of the severed hand, certainly produces a sinister impression, which we have referred to as the castration complex. But in the story of the treasure of Ramsnet, by Herodotus, the brilliant thief whom the princess wants to take by the hand holds out her brother's severed hand, and I believe that others will judge, as I do, that this feature does not produce any sinister impression. The immediate fulfillment of wishes in the ring of Polycrates strikes us as sinister as it does the king of Egypt himself. Yet our folk tales abound with instantaneous wish fulfillments, and we in no way have the impression of the sinister. In the tale of the three wishes, the woman is seduced by the fragrance of a roast sausage, stating that she too would like to eat one. Immediately it appears on his plate. Filled with anger at the reckless woman, the man wishes the sausage would hang from his nose. Here it is, hanging from his nose. All of this may be impressive, but it is by no means sinister. In general, the tale is openly placed on the ground of animism, of the omnipotence of thought and desires, but I could not cite any true fairy tale where something sinister happens. We have seen that this impression is most evoked when inanimate objects, images, or dolls come to life, but in Andersen's tales the crockery, the furniture, the tin soldier live on, and nothing could be further from sinister. Nor can the animation of the beautiful statue of Pygmalion be considered sinister. We have seen that catalepsy and the resurrection of the dead are sinister representations, but once again such things are very common in dreams. Who would dare say that it is sinister to see how, for example, Snow White opens her eyes in her coffin? Also the resurrection of the dead in miraculous stories, for example in those of the New Testament, evokes feelings that have nothing to do with the sinister. The unexpected return of the identical, which has produced such manifestly sinister effects on us, gives rise in a number of cases to very different reactions. We have already cited an example in which it serves for comic effect, and we could accumulate multiple similar cases. Other times the repetition is intended to reinforce, to underline something, etc. Also, where does the sinister character of silence, solitude, and darkness come from? Do not these factors indicate the intervention of danger in the genesis of the accidents, although they are the same conditions in which we see that children feel fear more frequently? And can we really rule out the factor of intellectual uncertainty, having admitted its importance to the sinister character of death? Here we are, then, ready to admit that in order to provoke the feeling of the sinister it is necessary that other conditions intervene, in addition to the thematic factors that we have postulated. Strictly speaking, it could be accepted that with what has been said the psychoanalytic interest in the problem is exhausted, that the rest probably requires to be studied from the aesthetic point of view, but with this we would open the door to doubt regarding the value of our concept, according to which the unheimlich, the sinister, comes from the heimisch, the familiar, which has been repressed. An observation may perhaps point us the way to resolve these uncertainties. Almost all the examples that contradict our hypothesis belong to the domain of fiction, of poetry. This would indicate that we must differentiate the sinister that is experienced, from the sinister that is only imagined or known by references. The sinister experienced depends on much simpler conditions, but it occurs in fewer cases. I believe that this form of the uncanny accepts, almost without exception, our attempts at solutions and can in each case be reduced to things formerly familiar and now repressed. Here, too, however, an important and psychologically significant distinction must be made, which can best be illustrated by appropriate examples. Let's take the sinister that emanates from the omnipotence of ideas, from the immediate fulfillment of wishes, from hidden nefarious forces, or from the return of the dead. It is impossible to confuse the condition that in these cases gives rise to the feeling of the sinister. We ourselves or our primitive ancestors have once accepted these three eventualities as realities. We were convinced of the real character of these processes. Today we no longer believe in them, we have overcome those ways of thinking, but we do not feel very sure of our new conceptions. The old beliefs survive in us, waiting for a confirmation. Therefore, as soon as something happens in this life, capable of confirming those old abandoned convictions, we experience the sensation of the sinister, and it is as if we said, so it is possible to kill another by the simple force of desire, it is possible that the dead continue to live and that they reappear in the places where they lived, and so on. Whoever, on the contrary, has completely and definitively abandoned such animistic convictions, will not be able to experience this form of the sinister. The most extraordinary coincidence between a wish and its fulfillment, the most enigmatic repetition of similar events in the same place or on the same date, the most deceptive visual perceptions and the most suspicious noises will not confuse him or arouse in him a fear that we can consider as fear of the sinister. So here we are dealing exclusively with something concerning reality testing, with a matter of material reality. Quite another is the sinister that emanates from the repressed infantile complexes of the castration complex, intrauterine fantasies, etc. Of course, the real experiences capable of awakening this genre of the sinister cannot be very frequent, since the feeling in question, when it occurs in real experiences, usually belongs to the previous group, but for the theory it is important to differentiate both categories. In the uncanny, due to infantile complexes, the question of material reality does not even arise, psychic reality appearing instead. In this case, we are dealing with the effective repression of a psychic content and the return of what is repressed, but not with a simple abolition of the belief in the reality of this content. We could say that while in one case a certain ideational content has been repressed, in the other the belief in its material reality has been. But this last formulation perhaps means an application of the term repression that transcends its legitimate limits. It would be more correct if, as far as this problem is concerned, we took into account a sensitive psychological difference, qualifying the state in which the animistic convictions of civilized man find themselves as a more or less complete overcoming. Our final formulation would then be the following: what is uncanny in experiences occurs when repressed infantile complexes are revived by an external impression, or when primitive convictions that have been overcome seem to find a new confirmation. Finally, our predilection for simple solutions and for clear expositions should not prevent us from recognizing that both forms of the uncanny, discerned here, do not always appear clearly separated in experience. If one takes into account that primitive convictions are intimately linked to infantile complexes and that they actually take root in them, it will not be surprising to see how their limits are blurred. The uncanny in fiction in fantasy, in the literary work does deserve a separate examination. First of all, its manifestations are much more multiform than those of the sinister experiential, since it encompasses it completely, in addition to other elements that do not occur in the conditions of experiencing. The contrast between what is repressed and what is overcome cannot be applied, without deep modifications, to the sinister of the poetic work, since the domain of fantasy presupposes that its content is exempt from the test of reality. Our apparently paradoxical conclusion reads as follows: much of what would be sinister in real life is not sinister in poetry. In addition, fiction has many means to cause sinister effects that do not exist in reality. Among the many licenses that the poet enjoys, there is also that of being able to choose the world of his evocation at will, so that it coincides with our familiar reality or moves away in any way from it. In any case, we will follow it. The world of fairy tales, for example, leaves the ground of reality from the beginning and openly takes the side of animistic convictions. Fulfillment of desires, secret forces, omnipotence of thought, animation of the inanimate, all very common effects in tales, cannot cause a sinister impression in them, since for this feeling to be born it is necessary, as we have seen, for judgment to be found. In doubt as to whether the incredible, overcome, could not, ultimately, be possible in reality, a question that from the beginning is decided by the conventions that govern the world of stories. In such a way, the fairy tale, the source of most of the examples that contradict our theory of the uncanny, practically illustrates the first of the cases mentioned. In the realm of fiction, many things that would be in real life are not sinister. To this are added, in the story, other factors that we will briefly mention later. The poet may also have created a world that, although less fantastic than that of stories, is nevertheless separated from the real world, by admitting supernatural beings, demons, or dead souls. All the sinister character that these figures could have then disappears to the extent that the conventions of this poetic reality are extended. The souls of Dantesque hell or the specters of Shakespeare's Hamlet, Macbeth, and Julius Caesar may be as gloomy as you like, but deep down they are as little sinister as, for example, the serene world of the Homeric gods. We adapt our judgment to the conditions of this fictitious reality of the poet, and we consider souls, spirits, and ghosts, as if they had an existence in it no less justified than ours in material reality. Here is a new case in which the feeling of the sinister is avoided. On the other hand, it is very different if the poet pretends to place himself in the field of common reality. It then adopts all the conditions that in real life govern the appearance of the sinister, and whatever it has this character in experiences it will also have it in fiction. But in this case the poet can exalt and multiply the sinister far beyond what is possible in real life, making happen what would never or rarely happen in reality. In a certain way, it frees us then to our superstition, which we had believed overcome. It deceives us by promising us vulgar reality, only to then get out of it. We react to their fictions as we would to our own experiences. Once we realize the mystification, it is already too late, since the poet has achieved his object, but for my part I affirm that he has not obtained a pure effect. We are left with a feeling of dissatisfaction, a kind of rancor for the attempted deception, a feeling that I experienced with particular clarity after reading Schnitzler's short story Die Weissagung, The Prophecy, and other productions of the genre that flirt with the miraculous. The writer still has a resource that allows him to evade our rebellion and at the same time improve the prospects of achieving his goals. This means consists in leaving us in suspense, for a long time, regarding what are the conventions that govern the world that he has adopted, or in avoiding until the end, with art and cunning, a decisive explanation about it. But, in any case, the noted circumstance that fiction creates new possibilities of the sinister, which cannot exist in real life, is fulfilled here. Strictly speaking, all these diverse forms can only be observed in that category of the uncanny that proceeds from the superseded. The sinister emanating from repressed complexes has greater tenacity and, disregarding a single condition, preserves in poetry all the sinister character that it had in real life. The other form, the one born from what has been surpassed, on the other hand, presents this character both in reality and in that fiction that is located in the field of material reality, but can lose it in the fictitious realities created by the poet's imagination. It is evident that the poet's licenses and, consequently, the privileges of fiction related to the evocation or the inhibition of the feeling of the sinister, have not been exhausted in the preceding observations. Faced with real experiences, we tend to adopt a uniformly passive position and find ourselves subject to the influence of the themes. On the other hand, we respond in a particular way to the poet's direction, through the emotional state in which he places us. Thanks to the expectations that he awakens in us, he manages to separate our affective capacity from a passionate tone to take it to another, and many times he knows obtain very different effects with the same subject. All this has been known for a long time and was surely considered carefully by the ideal aesthetic eons. We have been led, almost unintentionally, to this field of investigation, yielding to the desire to clarify the contradiction that certain examples mentioned above present in front of our theory of the uncanny. So we will now return to some of these. We recently wondered why the severed hand in Ramsnit's treasure does not produce the sinister impression that Hauff's The Story of the Severed Hand evokes. Now that we know the greater tenacity of the sinister emanating from the repressed complexes, this question seems to us more full of significance. The answer can be formulated without difficulty. In the first of these narratives we are not so much adapted to the emotions of the princess, as to the sovereign cunning of the masterful thief. The princess will surely not have been spared the feeling of the sinister, and we still consider it plausible. That has fallen faded, but for our part we do not feel anything sinister, because we do not place ourselves in his place, but in that of the thief. Other circumstances are what deprive us of the sinister impression in Nestroy's farce, Der Zerrissen, the Ragged Man, when the fugitive who is considered a murderer, every time he raises a trapdoor, sees the supposed specter of his victim emerge, exclaiming, desperate, but I did not kill more than one. Why this atrocious multiplication? We are aware of the circumstances prior to the scene and we cannot share the mistake of the ragged man, so that what is sinister for him only has irresistible humor for us. Even a true apparition, like that in Oscar Wilde's story The Canterville Spectre, loses all its rights to inspire at least terror, when the poet indulges in the joke of ridiculing and mocking it. Such is the independence that in the world of fiction there can be between the emotional effect and the subject chosen. As for fairy tales, they are not even intended to arouse distressing, that is, sinister feelings. Something that we fully understand and that leads us to ignore all the occasions in which such an effect would perhaps be possible. We have nothing to say about loneliness, silence, and darkness, except that these are really the factors with which childhood anxiety is linked, never fully extinguished in most beings. Psychoanalytic research has dealt elsewhere with this problem. And the sinister. Sigmund Freud.